The story of a king, painted in light and shadow. Our story does not begin in a palace, but in a quiet country home on the outskirts of Madrid, the Quinta del Sordo, the House of the Deaf Man. Here, in the early 1820s, an old, stone-deaf, and disillusioned man is painting. He is not painting for a client, nor for the king. He is painting for himself directly onto the plaster of his walls, covering them with the most terrifying and grotesque images the world has ever seen. Witches, demons, fighting pilgrims, and a monstrous giant devouring the body of a man. That painter is Francisco Goya, and these walls are his final, secret testament to the reign of the man he served, King Ferdinand VII. To understand the nightmare on Goya's walls, we must first understand the dream that preceded it. The flawed canvas of hope before Ferdinand, there was his father, Charles IV. Goya, as the official court painter, knew this family intimately. In his famous 1800 portrait, Charles IV of Spain and his family, he performs an act of masterful subversion. He paints them in all their finery, dripping with jewels and sashes, but their faces tell the real story. He captures the vacant look of the king, the imperious, controlling glare of Queen Maria Louisa, and the resentful, sullen face of the young heir, Prince Ferdinand, standing in the background shadows. Goya painted a family, but he revealed a nest of dysfunction. Even then, the people saw in Ferdinand a glimmer of hope. He was their counterpoint to the Queen's hated lover, Godoy. He was the future. When the tumult of Aranjuez in 1808 forced his father to abdicate, Spain celebrated. Goya, a man of the Enlightenment who believed in progress, would have felt that same surge of optimism. For a moment, the canvas of Spain's future looked bright. But then came Napoleon, the French emperor, with cunning deceit, stripped the crown from the young king at Bayonne and placed Spain under his boot. Ferdinand became a prisoner, and in doing so, became a myth. For 6 brutal years, as Spain bled in the Peninsular War, Goya witnessed the horror firsthand. He etched it into his haunting series, The Disasters of War, capturing the raw, savage reality of a nation fighting and dying in the name of its absent king, El Decido, the desired. Every act of heroism, every brutal reprisal, was for Ferdinand. The unveiling of the tyrant 1814. The monster was released from his cage. Napoleon fell, and Ferdinand returned to Spain. Goya, now in his late 60s, was reinstated as first court painter. The nation rejoiced. But the man who returned was not the savior from the myth. He was the sullen, resentful boy from Goya's old portrait, now grown into a paranoid and vindictive man. Ferdinand's first great act was a masterpiece of betrayal. He tore up the liberal constitution of 1812, the very document created by the men who had fought for him. He declared the heroes of the war to be traitors. He unleashed the Spanish Inquisition and his secret police, the Voluntarios Realistas, upon anyone who dared to think freely. Goya, the Enlightenment man, now had to paint the tyrant who is extinguishing its light. His official portraits of Ferdinand from this period are technical marvels, but they are chilling. He captures the king's heavy, sensual lips, his hooded eyes, and his immense physical presence. But there is no soul, no warmth. It is the portrait of a slab of absolute power, of a man Goya himself reportedly called the worst in a long line. This was the beginning of the ominous decade, a reign of terror fueled by Ferdinand's personal depravities. The court became a nest of spies and sycophants. Rumors of the king's perversions, his voyeurism, his cruelty to his wives, and his use of blackmail became the currency of the realm. Spain became a kingdom held hostage by the pathologies of its monarch. The black paintings, the silent scream it, is here we return to the Quinta del Sordo. By 1819, Goya was old, profoundly deaf, and had survived a near-fatal illness. The world outside his home was a suffocating hell of Ferdinand's making. the silence of his deafness amplified the screams he saw in his mind's eye. Trapped in his silent world, he began to paint his truth, not on canvas for the court, but on the walls of his own home. The black paintings are Goya's uncensored diary of the ominous decade. They are not merely mythological scenes. They are political and psychological allegories of Ferdinand's Spain, Saturn devouring his son. This is the most famous and the most terrifying. A wild-eyed monster, a figure of absolute power gone mad, consumes the body of a smaller man. It is Goya's vision of King Ferdinand, the patriarch of the nation, devouring his own children, the Spanish people and their hopes for the future. Witches' Sabbath, or the Great He-Goat, a group of grotesque, witch-like figures huddle in the dark, worshipping a great black goat who lectures them. This is the Camarilla, Ferdinand's debauched inner circle, hanging on the every word of their demonic master. It is a portrait of blind fanaticism and fight with cudgels. Two men, trapped up to their knees in mud, brutally club each other to death. This was Goya's prophecy. He saw that Ferdinand's divisive reign was sinking the nation into a mire from which it could not escape, turning brother against brother. He was painting the coming Carlist wars before they even began. These paintings were Goya's sanity in an insane world. They were his private rebellion, a secret mural of the soul of a nation being tortured by its king. The final brushstroke. Goya, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere any longer, exiled himself to Bordeaux, France, in 1824, leaving the black paintings behind on the walls of his house. He died there, far from the king he despised. Ferdinand VII died in 1833, his final act of spite disinheriting his conservative brother in favor of his infant daughter was the spark that ignited the civil war Goya had prophesied. The Felon King left behind a legacy written in blood, but Goya left behind a legacy of truth. He painted the hope, he documented the horror, and on the silent walls of his farmhouse he captured the tyrant's true shadow. He ensured that long after the king's body had rotted away, the world would forever be able to look upon his monstrous soul. The echo in the silence while Spain erupted in the fire Ferdinand had kindled. Francisco Goya lived out his final years in the relative peace of Bordeaux. The cacophony of the Carlist war, the clash of steel, the crack of muskets, the cries of warring brothers was a storm he could see only in letters from home. His deafness, once a curse that trapped him with his inner demons, had become a shield. It insulated him from the din of the world he had so accurately predicted, leaving him to wrestle with the echoes in his mind. He was not idle. Even in old age, his hands needed to speak. He experimented with miniatures on ivory, tiny portraits of haunting intensity. He completed his final and perhaps most enigmatic series of etchings, the Disparates or Follies. They were a continuation of the themes from his farmhouse walls: flying men, phantom processions, figures trapped in sacks, all swirling in a dreamscape of the absurd and the terrifying. It was as if, having purged the specific horror of Ferdinand's reign onto his walls, he was now exploring the universal madness that lay beneath all human endeavor. One of his last known drawings is of a very old, bearded man walking with two canes, under which Goya wrote, "An aprondo, I am still learning." He was a man who had seen the absolute best and worst of humanity, who had dined with kings and painted nightmares. And yet, till his last breath in 1828, he remained a student of the human condition. He died quietly, a world away from the country whose soul he had rendered in light and darkness, leaving his greatest and most terrible secret hidden on the walls of the Quinta del Sordo, a legacy on plaster. A legacy in blood. As Goya's body was laid to rest in France, Ferdinand's legacy roared to life. The First Carlist War was everything Goya had foreseen. It was not a war of noble armies, but a savage. Intimate conflict that pitted city against countryside, neighbor against neighbor. The scene Goya had painted in his farmhouse, fight with cudgels, was no longer an allegory. It was the daily news from across the Pyrenees. Spain was mired in the mud of its own making, bludgeoning itself to death over the spiteful will of a dead king. Ferdinand, the Felon King, had bequeathed to Spain a tangible inheritance: political instability, economic ruin, and a cycle of civil wars that would bleed the nation for a century. His name became a byword for tyranny, his reign a cautionary tale of squandered hope. His legacy was written in the blood of his people, scarring the very landscape he had ruled. Goya's legacy, meanwhile, remained silent, locked away on plaster walls. It was an inheritance of a different kind, a prophetic truth, a psychological portrait of the poison that had caused the sickness. While one man left a legacy of action that led to ruin, the other left a legacy of vision that explained it. For 50 years after Goya's death, as Spain continued to tear itself apart, his final, thunderous statement on the nature of power remained a secret known to almost no one. The walls speak the Quinta del Sordo passed through different hands until, in 1874, it was acquired by a French banker, Baron Émile d'Erlanger. By then, the murals were deteriorating. Recognizing their immense, if terrifying, importance, the Baron undertook the delicate and revolutionary process of transferring the paintings from the plaster walls to canvas. It was a painstaking act of artistic salvation, the silent scream that had been trapped in a deaf man's private home was finally being prepared for the world. After being exhibited at the 1878 Paris Exposition, where they shocked and mesmerized the public, the Baron donated the 14 black paintings to the Spanish state. They eventually found their home in Madrid's Prado Museum, and here lies the final stunning irony. In the very same museum, you can see Goya's official portraits of Ferdinand VII, the king in his opulent robes, looking out with cold, regal authority. And then, you can walk into another room and stand before Goya's true verdict. You can stand before the horrifying visage of Saturn devouring his son, there in the hallowed halls of Spain's National Gallery. The public facade and the secret nightmare hang in eternal judgment of each other. The king's official image is rendered hollow and false by the raw, terrifying truth of the black paintings. Goya, the court painter, had fulfilled his duty. But Goya, the artist, had told the truth. The tyrant's shadow once cast over a living nation is now confined to history books. But Goya captured its essence, its universal and timeless horror. He ensured that long after Ferdinand's commands faded, the silent, painted scream of his deaf artist would echo for all time, a permanent warning of what happens when reason sleeps and monsters awaken. The verdict in the gallery: to truly understand the end of this story, one must walk the marble floors of the Museo Nacional del Prado today. You can stand before Goya's official portraits of the Bourbon court. Here is Ferdinand VII in his ermine-collared robes, the Order of the Golden Fleece. Around his neck, Goya has rendered the silks and velvets with breathtaking skill. The king is imposing, solid, a pillar of the state. It is a portrait of power, crafted by the finest hand in the kingdom. It is a magnificent, state-sanctioned lie. Then you walk down the hall and enter room 67. The atmosphere changes. The air grows cooler. The room is circular, and the light is low. Here, there is a hushed reverence, but it is not the reverence for beauty. It is the awe of standing before something terrible and true. Here hang the black paintings. On these canvases, the world Goya, painted in secret, finally speaks. Your eyes are drawn to the wild, primal horror of Saturn. You see the pathetic, huddled masses in a pilgrimage to San Isidro. You feel the claustrophobia of the great he-goat. There is no silk here, no polished metals, only raw pigment, darkness, and the texture of a soul in agony. This is the final courtroom. On one side of the museum stands the accused, the public image of the king. Here, in this room, is the evidence for the prosecution, presented by his own star witness. Goya, the king's servant, becomes his eternal judge. The paintings are his. Closing argument, a silent, damning indictment that rings louder than any spoken word. They do not just depict Ferdinand's era. They flay it open, exposing the psychological rot at its core. In this gallery, the Felon King is forever on trial, and the verdict is all around you on the walls. Two tombs, two legacies: King Ferdinand. 7 lies entombed within the royal pantheon of El Escorial, a majestic, severe monastery northwest of Madrid. He rests among kings and queens, a name carved in marble, a link in a long dynastic chain. His tomb is a monument of cold, stone, and fading glory, a historical site where guides recount the facts of his disastrous reign. It is a repository for bones, a final silent period at the end of a terrible sentence. His legacy is one of finite destruction, a series of wars fought, a constitution torn, colonies lost. It is a fixed, cold thing studied by historians. Francisco Goya lies elsewhere, but his true sarcophagus is the Prado. His legacy is not stone, but living paint. It breathes. It changes with every generation that stands before it. For a 19th-century Spaniard, the black paintings were a raw, recent memory. For a European in the 1930s, they were a prophecy of rising fascism. For a modern visitor, they are a timeless exploration of political terror, human cruelty, and the abyss of the mind. One man's legacy is an epitaph for a dead king. The other's is a living conversation about humanity itself. Ferdinand, in his quest for absolute power, achieved only a ruinous and despised immortality. Goya, in his quest for truth, achieved a relevance that will never die. The king who demanded to be seen has been eclipsed by the deaf painter who saw too much. The enduring shadow, the eternal light, the shadow cast by Ferdinand VII, was long and dark, but it was finite. It was the shadow of a single, flawed, and cruel man. It brought misery and death, and its consequences scarred Spain for over a century. But as with all things political, the specifics of his tyranny, the names, the dates, the specific betrayals eventually recede into the specialized pages of history. The light cast by Goya's genius, however, is eternal. He took the specific darkness of his time and transformed it into a universal warning. The Felon King is now a ghost, a historical curiosity. But the monsters Goya painted are immortal. Saturn is every state that consumes its children. The fight with cudgels is every senseless civil war. The great he-goat is every demagogue who preys on the desperate and the ignorant. This was Goya's ultimate, unintentional revenge. Ferdinand used Goya to project an image of power, but Goya used Ferdinand to understand the nature of monstrosity. The king saw the artist as a tool. The artist saw the king as a subject, his most challenging and most terrifying. He forced Ferdinand to sit for one last portrait, the secret one he painted on his own walls. And that is the one that will last forever. The scar becomes a chasm for decades after the Felon King's death. The legacy he bequeathed was a festering wound. The Carlist Wars came and went, each time reopening the same divisions between the urban liberal and the rural traditionalist, the modernizer and the zealot, the centralized state and the autonomous region. The two Spains that Goya had painted sinking into the mud were locked in a seemingly endless struggle. The cudgels were replaced by more modern rifles. The battlefields grew larger, but the fundamental ideological hatred remained the same. Then came the 20th century. The wound did not heal. It deepened, turning from a scar into a gaping chasm. In 1936, the chasm finally swallowed the nation whole. The Spanish Civil War was not a new conflict, but the ultimate, horrifying crescendo of the one Ferdinand had started. The nationalists, led by General Franco, were the direct ideological heirs of the Carlists. Their cry of "For God and for Spain" echoed the old slogan of God, Country, King. They were supported by the church, the landowners, and the forces of absolute, centralized authority. The replicants were the heirs of the persecuted liberals, a chaotic coalition of constitutionalists, socialists, and anarchists fighting for a modern, secular Spain. When the bombs fell on Guernica, when writers and intellectuals were executed by firing squads, when the streets of Madrid became a front line, it was the fulfillment of Goya's darkest prophecies. The brutal, intimate violence he had etched in the disasters of war was now amplified with the terrifying efficiency of modern warfare. The monstrous, irrational power of his Saturn was now embodied in a totalitarian regime. The ghost of Ferdinand VII, one could imagine, watched the carnage and saw not a tragedy, but a vindication of his belief that power could only be maintained through an iron fist. Goya's mud-caked prophecy had been fulfilled in blood and iron. The fight with cudgels was over. The chasm had chosen its victor. A dialogue in eternity, a coda. Imagine a timeless, empty hall in the Prado. On one wall hangs Goya's regal portrait of Ferdinand VII. On the opposite wall hangs us, Saturn devouring his son. Two spectral figures stand in the gloom, one before each painting. "Look," says the shade of King Ferdinand, gesturing to his official portrait. "They remember me, King of Spain and the Indies, the House of Bourbon. My name is carved in the pantheon of El Escorial. My bloodline continued. I held my kingdom together against the traitors who would have dismantled it. I made the hard choices. I am a fact of history." From across the room, the shade of Goya does not turn. His gaze is fixed on the horror of his own creation. "I see no king," Goya whispers, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "I see only the face of a man who feared his own children. History remembers your name, sire, but I remembered their faces. The faces of the men you declared heroes, then traitors. The face of the woman who died under your physicians' knives. The faces in the crowd who cheered your return, only to watch you become the monster they had fought. Lies and slander." Ferdinand retorts, his voice echoing with phantom authority. "I brought order. I crushed rebellion. You brought silence." Goya counters, his voice gaining a quiet strength. "The silence of the prison cell, the silence of the censored press, the silence of the grave. I know that silence well. I've lived in it. It forced me to listen to what was underneath. And this," he says, finally gesturing to the grotesque image of Saturn, "is what I heard. Not order, a scream." Ferdinand stares at the monstrous painting, at the raw, undeniable truth of it. A truth that has outlived all his decrees and all his power. For the first time, the king has no reply. The final word de monarch can command armies, sign laws, and shape the borders of a nation for a lifetime. His legacy is one of power, measured in years of rule and lines in a history book. An artist, if he is brave enough, can capture the truth of that power. His legacy is one of feeling, measured in the eternal gasp of understanding from those who witness his work. Ferdinand VII ruled Spain for 2 decades. Goya rules its soul forever.